Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're in New Zealand. Welcome to today's webinar. My name's Sarah. I'm from Marsh. Today's webinar is on critical risk management. It's a practical guide, and it's going to be presented by Mark Alston, who has joined us before. Today's webinar, it's a very popular topic. As with all our webinars, you can earn 5 CPD points via the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. The webinar will be recorded and shared later via a podcast, video, email later in the day. I will put some links during the webinar up to some of Mark's previous webinars that have been very well attended, so you can have a look at what he's done before with us. And we'll have a Q&A session. You can ask those questions in the Q&A channel on your webinar software, and we'll get to them at the end. So today, most of you have probably heard about Mark Alston. He's done a couple of webinars with us. Utilising his operational background, Mark assists clients to develop programs unique to them that drive leadership and cultural change. His focus on these solutions combines a safety differently approach with the principles of human and organisational performance, working with frontline leadership to support employees at all levels. So thank you so much for joining us, Mark. Over to you.
No worries. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate you taking your time out of today. It's a topic that's been coming up a fair bit recently with a number of organisations that I work with, and they're just starting to get into this critical risk management. Now, it's nothing new. Critical risk management's been around. Geez, it was when I first exposed to it was back with Rio Tinto back in around 2010, maybe. Was when we were starting to really start to look at it for the first time. So it's not new, but it is new for a lot of organisations, and it can seem quite daunting. So today is just a real quick snapshot of some practical steps that you can sort of project plan with and move forward with. So I welcome any questions and any comments, and just throw them up there in the Q&A, and Sarah will look after that for us. So welcome, and thanks for joining us. So let's get into it. What is critical risk management? So it's managing the risks of those material unwanted events. In other words, basically critical risks. Now, we'll have a bit of a health and safety focus on this one today because we're mainly dealing with health and safety here, but it doesn't matter what the risk is, and they typically sit to the right of your risk matrix. Those, it's either a fatality, multiple fatalities, or even total permanent disability. I've seen a lot of clients take that approach, but it's making sure that we have a systematic approach to medical controls, that they're in place and will be effective 100% of the time. Because at the end of the day, this is the stuff right at the front line, and that stops people getting killed or, total disability. That's what we're looking for. So this is the stuff that matters. Now, in terms of building that business case to do this in your organisation, the question could be why. Well, let's just have a look at some of the stats. In 2020, there are 178 fatalities in workplace fatalities. 2019, 183. 2018, 146. 17, 189. 186 fatalities in 2016. In the last 10 years, I think it was based to 2019, in the 10 years up to 2019, 2,718 workplace fatalities have occurred. It's 2,700 people, 18 people not going home that were just doing their job or were at work, workplace-related fatalities. So some of those were bystanders. Top 4, 12% fall from height. There's a lot of businesses that have work at heights as a risk. 11% dropped objects, 12% hit by a moving object, and by far the largest of all for workplace fatalities, and it's no surprise to anyone, is vehicle collision. So 37% over a third of workplace fatalities were to do with basically driving. Now, I'm yet to work with any organisation where driving isn't a risk, and will continue to be a risk unless we can eliminate either cars or people, or trucks and people. And I think we're a long way from that. So, again, why do we need to separate these critical risks? Apart from obviously, this is the ultimate price that our people might pay. The other thing is, how much time do we have? I'm yet to work with anyone, any organisation. So, I do a lot of workshops and facilitate a lot of learning teams and things like that. And one of the questions I always ask is, does anyone walk up to you and say, I'm going to give you less work to do and more time to do it in? It just never happens, right? So risk assessments, we're meant to assess risk on all the things that could be a hazard, right? That's been the standard, and we've all been in those. I mean, I can remember sitting in risk registers where we were looking at, people replacing toner in the photocopier at work, or, making a cup of coffee and things like that. And sitting, exhaustively in developing risk registers for those, but we just don't have the time. So if you were to think in your own organisation, how many risks do you have? Right? How many risks? How many tasks do you have? How many risks would each of those tasks have? And then of those risks, of those tasks, how many controls there would be? Do you physically have the time to actually ensure they're 100% effective every single control? And the answer is no, you don't. We don't have the time. We've got limited access to people these days. We're just doing so much more with less. We can even see now, and it's not going to get easier. There's a labour shortage happening in Australia right now, reportedly. A labour shortage right around Australia right now. We cannot get people. So we're going to have less time to do these things. We'll have less access to our workforce to help us out. And, one thing we can't do is put more time in the day, right? So we have to prioritise. And where should you prioritise your time? So, when you're looking at building a business case, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It's all about time, right? It's time management. Where do we want to focus our time? So this is the why. It's the stuff that could kill our people. And if we've got a limited number of hours in the day, well, we should focus on the most critical things. So let's have a look at this, what I call our little roadmap here. And look, there's a number of different models around, but I just think this is just easy to follow, right? The first thing we want to do is establish our framework. I'll go through each of these. Establish our framework. That's that, processes, procedures, get management commitment, make sure, committed to go for it. We've got to prepare for the workshops. I'm going to talk about that. Identify our critical risks, right? What are they? And we'll talk about that. Cause and controls, the hazards and controls, whatever. I tend not to use too much risk language when I'm talking this stuff. I just talk, like a human, not a risk person. Pick those critical controls. What are the most critical of those controls? Because there could be, 60, 70 controls for one risk, but really, if we were all to break it down, all the controls, we could get a lot of controls. But what are the most critical? We'll talk about that, and we'll provide a definition. I know there's a number out there. And then we'll start to talk about where the rubber hits the road and that control design, making sure it's robust, making sure it's resilient, making sure we've got those things in place. And then lastly, we'll talk about, how we're going to verify that the controls are in place and effective. And, so they'll work, right? So that's what we're after. So that's what we're going to run through for the rest of the short presentation this morning. So let's start with one, establishing that framework. And the first thing we need to do is get management commitment, right? You need to build the business case, right? And by that, you need to demonstrate that need to the business that this work has to be done. The reason you need it, unless you have this, from my experience, unless you have it driven by the top down, you're playing at the edges, right? You will not get what you need, right? Risk assessments cost money, right? Now, it mightn't be physical dollars, like it mightn't be, unless you're paying for external facilitators or external consultants, right? But you can do this in-house, and a lot of companies do. But there'll be lost production because you're going to need people who do the work. You're going to have to pull them out of production, right? You're going to need facilities. You're going to need time. You're going to need the time for the facilitator. You're going to need someone to put this together. So this all takes money, right? Communication plans, all those sort of things cost money. You might need some graphic design work. You might need some communication materials. You might need some training. So this should be budgeted for, right? I've yet to see any, I shouldn't say any, but most organisations don't budget for two things when they're developing their health and safety strategy and working out where they're going to put resources. They don't budget for incidents, for investigating incidents, and they don't budget for risk assessments and managing risk. How many risk assessments are you going to need to do? How many people it's going to take? Prepare the business case. So two things first you need to do: demonstrate the need to managers, get their commitment, and senior leadership. It has to come from the top down, because if you don't have their commitment to release their people and pay what it costs to get this in place, it's not going to happen, right? You cannot ninja this. This needs to come in as a proper project, and build the business case, sell it, and then undertake change management with it. Look for those risks in your business. I work with some organisations where this is quite simple because they're just one site, might have, anywhere between 400 to 1,000 workers at one site. That's great. We can manage that in one site. But then I also work with clients with a diverse range of sites all over Australia, and some of those might have 3 or 4 or 5 people at it, right? How are we going to manage implementing critical risk management at those sites as opposed to the larger sites? Look for those risks of implementation. And that's what I mean by change management. The risks of implementation. Do your change management and put the business case forward. So that's the first thing we need to do. Then once we've got that, it's pretty simple. Let's get the horse in front of the cart. Let's establish our framework, right? Let's make sure we know what our overarching process is going to be. And I'm going to walk through a process for the rest of today. Have the procedure ready to go, right? Make sure we define clear accountabilities and put those accountabilities into management's or whoever's role descriptions. And by accountabilities and role descriptions, I'm talking about terms like who's going to own the risk, critical control owners. If you're going to apply critical control owners, can you do that? Is your organisation big enough to have these sort of roles? These are the decisions you need to make, right? But make sure it's clearly defined who has them, and then make sure that we train those people before we start and what their roles are going to be. Don't make it up as you go along. If we're going to be a health and safety professional, if we're going to be a professional in our role, we treat this as a project. Let's plan, do, check, act, right? Let's make sure we run through it. So part of this is having all this up ready to go at the front end. Now, my version of this is that the less is best, right? Less clutter, use what you've already got where you can. And make it as slimline as you can, right? Don't add a heap of stuff into it that you don't need to, but make sure we're prepared. Make sure you're prepared for those answers. You might need, and a communications plan is a great thing to do. Again, with a communications plan, pick your targets. Who you're going to have to communicate to. Senior leadership, line management, so supervisors and up, the workforce itself. You're going to have to demonstrate the need to them. Right, they're going to have to see how this is important, how this will add value, and how it won't add work, right? And this is what we want to do. What training do we need? Have these things ready to go at the start. A little bit of time, a little bit of preparation here will really help down the track. What tools are we going to use? So when you're doing your risk assessments, are you going to use like bow ties or simple course control analysis? What tools will you use? Simple rack tools will work well as well. Pick your facilitators. Make sure we have all this stuff ready to go. And then we pull the trigger, right? So we move on to our next step. We prepare for the workshops. We do our research, and I'm going to go into the research a little bit more in the next slide. Select the team. So who's going to be involved in each of these workshops? So when we do critical risk workshops, we do our first workshop and this is my advice, has practically worked for us, is we do our first workshops or series of workshops, we identify what our critical risks are. Then we basically do a separate risk assessment on each of the risks. So we might need a broad team for our first one and then very focused teams for the rest. And it might be more than one. We might need to do more than one to get everything we need. But we need to select the team, right? And the team's got to consist of people who do the work, right? People who currently do the work. It can't just be full of middle management and supervisors. It's got to be, if we're talking about, if our critical risks involve the people on the tools, it's the people on the tools that need to be in the room, right? Make sure the room's big enough, right? Make sure you got the right facilities, whiteboards, flip charts, whatever you need. My advice, and I teach this in our risk assessment masterclass, is do not use Excel spreadsheets up on a wall. The only time I use a projector when I'm doing any risk assessment workshop is maybe to help give context in terms of, putting up videos of the work or photos of the work or the area or giving some of those sort of information. Then I turn it off, right? It's all about the conversations. That's where the information lies. Allow yourself enough time, right? Allow yourself enough time. If you're going to do something, allow yourself an afternoon. Don't try and do one of these workshops in half an hour or 2 hours. You're going to be rushed. Now, if it takes 2 hours, awesome, right? You've done a great job, right? But allow yourself more time. And this gets back to building the business case, getting the management commitment so that people will be there, right? We've all sat in really poor risk assessments where there's no innovation, barely any discussion, and then all of a sudden we rush through, get a heap of groupthink. Yes, copy paste. If this is what this turns into, you've wasted your time, right? So prepare, allow yourself enough time, get the right team, make sure the room's good, make sure you got it for long enough. So again, it's part of that project planning, right? I mentioned research. Research is vital here, right? So especially for that first workshop and even the subsequent ones, it'll really come in handy. So do your internal research, right? Make sure, troll your databases, troll your spreadsheets, whatever you have, look at other risk assessments, find the hazards with the critical potential, right? With a critical potential consequence. Get your high potential incidents, have a look at them, get your register out, have a look at your tasks. What are all the tasks you do, right? Have that information handy. That's part of your job if you're going to help facilitate these workshops, especially that first one, right? Have a really good look at that. The second one is go external, right? Go external. One of the issues that brought up with Dreamworld, with the regulator, was that they didn't acknowledge the risks that the rest of the world was having with the similar or the same ride. Okay, and they didn't put that together because they hadn't experienced in Australia with their ride. But some of the commentary was about the fact that there were similar events that had happened over in the States and Europe. So let's do our research, right? So I started today with fertility statistics. Now, Safe Work Australia has some great information there, right? Industry-specific associations are fantastic, including the state regulators, right? So each of the states puts out, so one of the things I do is I go through all the state alerts, safety alerts for the last, 5-10 years, pull them out. What, all the high potentials, all the fatality stuff, how was it caused? What was the mechanism, right? These are all credible risks because either there was a fatality or someone nearly died, right? So this information has never been more readily available for us. This helps drive what we call credible scenarios, right? Grab as much of that stuff as you can. As I said, the state regulators, both for like WorkSafe type ones, and if you're in mining, the mining regulators, transport, they all have a lot of stuff that you can look at. So really encourage you to get as much data as you can. The bigger the net, the more credible you'll be with your scenarios. So we've we've put our business case, we've got our permission, right? We've done our preparation, including our research, and we're rocking up for our first workshop. And this sets the tone for the rest, right? We identify our critical risks. Now, one of my preferred methods is just to brainstorm, right? Because we'll clear it up when we actually go into the individual risks themselves, if we've got some double up, or if it's actually not credible. We've thought we've had a critical risk in the first session. Then when we actually did the workshop, we actually couldn't find a credible scenario for how we do the work where we're working. So brainstorming session, right? Again, if you've got an organization, trying as much breadth of experience actually of people doing the work. Now, I'm not saying exclude management, right? But the people who do the work should be the majority of the people in the room, right? And look, the good thing about this is it doubles up. It's consultation, right? So it doubles up in our requirement there. And it's the right bloody thing to do because they have the knowledge, right? Use the research we've already got. It sets that scope, right? We may need more than one workshop, right? May need more than one. And that's cool, right? We might need a couple, depends on how big we are. But at the end of the day, once we've got all these risks, we can start to see some clear themes. Yeah. And I guarantee you, if you're depending upon your industry, you'll have the common ones that will know. These are generally known risks, right? Because they're so familiar to us because of the amount of fatalities either within our own industry, within our own organization, within our own country, or even overseas. These are pretty known risks. Driving on public roads, like, vehicles and pedestrians, working at heights, confined spaces, electrical energy, stored energy, right? Entanglement. These are pretty, broad risks that just about everyone has. Now, when I've done this with most organizations, we end up, particularly, we've ended up with some like above 15 to 20. That's cool because it is what it is. Do not get sucked in that you've got too many, right? You can group some, and because we'll use those as a communication tool, but be very careful because they have to have the same controls, right? So similar risks with the same controls. That's what we're after at the end of the day when we start to theme, right? Identify those credible risks. What are we exposed to that could cause that workplace fatality? What is a critical risk? So, yeah. So I put up a risk matrix, and anyone that knows me will know these are not my favorite things, right? Which is why I'm sort of having a laugh. Not my favorite things. However, they help prioritize, right? But to me, it's in the risk scenario, so I don't really need this. But for most organizations, your critical risks are going to be in this column 5. It doesn't matter what the likelihood is. It doesn't matter if it's rare or almost said. And I'm not talking about inherent risk. I'm talking about your current residual risk, right? What's your current risk, right? Any likelihood, because we don't live in a world with no controls, right? Any likelihood, what is your credible risk which will have a critical outcome? So again, up to your organization. So I'm not going to tell you what's the best way to do this. Me personally, it's total permanent disability / fatality. So anything that falls into those. So it actually might be, major critical. It depends how you define critical risk, but that's what we're talking about. I'm not talking about an LTI, right? A lot of organizations just stick with fatality, right? Now, again, that's a health and safety thing. If you're looking at enterprise risk, it could be that if you suffered this, it would shut your organization down or severely damage your ability to operate, right? So we could be looking at, it could be a severe hit to your reputation, right? So it's anything you want to have that critical focus on, that's where we're looking for. Critical risk. Now, you'll notice I keep talking about credible. Now, credible. What do we mean by credible? It's got to be believed or trusted, right? It's got to be plausible, right? It's able to be likely to be true, right? It's got to be reasonable, right? And we can only discover that when we're looking at the context of our work, and I'll talk about that when I look at the first actual risk assessment, where we're looking at the causes and controls. It must be in here, right? Don't go down the path of too many what ifs, right? If we don't do a job this way, if no one could be exposed to it, because they're not there, that it would be like unbelievably unlikely that someone would be there, then it's not a critical risk, right? Be credible. Trust the people who do the work, and also trust the research you've done, because the research will tell you whether it's a risk or not as well, whether you could be exposed, right? So they could tell you, yeah, these are the risks we're exposed to. And the people in the room will tell you whether it's credible that actually, yeah, that could happen to us, right? That could happen to us. Don't go down too many what ifs. If you start stacking up, it's unlikely to be true. It's unlikely to be credible. We don't have enough time to focus on risks that aren't credible. It's one of my bugbears with investigations, where we overclassify and we spend too much time investigating things which aren't credible high potential events. And I know there'd be a lot of you nodding your head right there with that one. Right, so let's get our credible risks. Right, so we've identified a suite of credible risks. Could be, 10, 15, 20, whatever it is, right? Our next step is to pull each of those apart, right? So we do that series of workshops for each risk. So what we're looking to do firstly is discover the context of work. I'll talk about that in a second. Identify credible causes, right? What could cause someone to fall from height? Well, might be that there's no edge protection. It might, edge protection. It might be that their equipment, their working heights equipment was faulty, right? There might be a whole range of things, right? Couple of tips, right? We don't need to assess the risk. We've already done it. We did it in the first workshop when we identified that it was credible, that it was critical. So we don't need to go through that whole process, right? The other thing is we want real depth, right? We want to dig deep, right? And the last thing I want to say is, don't let whatever bloody tool you decide to use, and sorry, I shouldn't say that, any tool you decide to do, I don't care if it's bow tie. I don't care, like my preference is like just simple like cause and controls. I don't care what you use. I don't care how you develop it. Don't let that process where you type it all up drive your conversation in the risk assessment workshop, right? I simply use a brainstorming session again, and I use whiteboards. So I'm sure you can probably see that. I think this one I did for a client with confined spaces, and I use whiteboards. What could cause it? What are credible, right? And we just brainstorm, right? And we're looking around what's credible, right? We give everyone a voice, and I use these whiteboards or flip charts. I just simply take photos, and then later on I plug it into that template that we've built, right? We're looking for this. This is really good. Again, make sure, so if we're dealing with something like electrical, you want electricians in the room and that are currently doing the work, right? And some of you, that might mean involving your contractors. Well, that's what you do. You involve your contractors. They've got a great depth of knowledge. So grab them, right? And you'll notice I keep talking about context. So context is the first thing I do with any of my risk assessments. And I'm looking for this. So this comes from Todd Conklin. And the context is all that information that surrounds how the work gets done, right? It's the circumstances, right? It's the big picture, right? If we look at say a shutdown for a factory, right, where everyone's, they're doing major maintenance overhaul. The amount of people that are involved in their individual tasks, yep, that's one thing, but it's the overall picture we want. Everything from the supply chain, the logistics, to the review at the end of it. That's the context of work. We want everything involved. So let's look at work, right? I'm just going to, for some of you that know me, you'll have seen my previous presentations. You'll see me talk about this before. Work. So we call it the blue line. This is how work gets done over time. Now, normally we have a black line, right? So that black line is our procedures, and it'll be straight across, written in ink, SWIMs, SWIs, SOPs, whatever you want to call them, how we do the work. Work's never done that way. It's messy, right? Because of all these things that occur, right? And it's only when we drift to hazard or drift to risk that we worry about it. But these are the things that it drives our context, right? So the first thing I do with my workshop with people talking about tasks, and say it might be excavation, right? That might be the risk we're exploring, people getting engulfed in an excavation. Well, tell me about excavation. When does it work well? When doesn't it work well? What sort of constraints do you have? Do you ever, what happens if the machine breaks down, right? Do you always have all the people? When's things not work? I don't care about how the procedure says it. All I care about is how it's done in the field, because this is where I'm going to discover some uncertainty. This is when I'm going to discover some unknowns. This is the context, right? So look for the context of the work. Make sure this is the first thing you do when you're doing your risk assessments with people, apart from letting them know what they're letting them know what they're there for. But have these conversations. This is why I say again, invest the time. Do not rush them, because this takes time, right? System weaknesses, right? When's how's weather affected? What happens then? What's production pressure like? What happens if we're not getting it done in time? This is the uncertainty, and these are the things that drive our risks, right? So spend the time. So when I talk about context, make sure we capture that first, and from this we'll start to get credible causes for our scenario. I'll ask that shortly. And it only comes from the people who do the work, right? So have the right people in the room. I cannot stress this enough. So we get that. I'm going to just go back a bit. Sorry, this is the first time I've just put this together for this webinar, this pack. We get all our causes, and you can see in the left-hand whiteboard there, I'm getting all our causes. What could it cause, right? A confined space incident for this area, right? Then basically all I do is go, okay, what controls do we have in place, right? That's what I go to next. What are our controls? But I want to be specific, right? This is for, we go through this in our masterclass, not just PPE, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're going to end up with is a very detailed risk assessments with a lot of detail on our controls, because this is the information, right, we should be putting into our procedures, our purchasing, database, our maintenance programs, our SWIs, our inductions. This is where it should come from. Too often it comes the other way around. We grab it from a procedure and we put it in a risk assessment. No, wrong way to go around things. We've done this for years. We've got the dog wagging the tail, and the tail wagging the dog in that area. This is where we should be getting it from, and it's really going to become specific, really become important when we look at critical controls. So again, don't just put PPE, right? Be specific. Don't just put maintenance. What are you talking about? Maintenance of what? What frequency? So I'll give an example there of a mining car. So a vehicle used in underground mining probably has, check the brakes every 10,000 kilometres. Well, that doesn't account for an underground vehicle in mining, which does its whole life in a high salt environment, stuck in third gear, low range. I'm pretty sure we're going to want to check those brakes more often than every 10,000 kilometres, right? So how often, right? Let's be specific. This is where the detail is. And it doesn't matter if it's a critical control risk assessment or any risk assessment, my advice is all the same. One of the things I do to assist with that is I prime the risk assessment team. So you can all read that there is, and take a snippet of that or a photo of that. I know Sarah's recording this and it'll be available to watch later. But this is a specific disclaimer that I put on all of my risk assessments, because I'm sick of going through and asking for controls, and I'll get take 5, supervision, induction, training ad nauseum. It drives me nuts, right? So to stop that happening, I put a disclaimer as I say, so there's two things. Firstly, I'm not interested in generic controls that are site-wide for a number of risks, right? So if you use a pre-task risk assessment, like a take 5, it would be for all your tasks, right? So it's not to the specific risk we're talking about. Regardless of the fact whether or not they work. It's just generic site-wide, right? We're not interested in that, and it certainly won't be a critical control. The other thing I do is we acknowledge some human factor causes, and by human factor causes, and rewrite that however you want, feel free to use it. I'm talking about things like fatigue. I'm thinking things, fitness for work, error, human error, right? I'm not interested in human error maybe if it's caused by some of our system issues, but those things like fatigue, fitness for work, lack of training, those again are site-wide risks for just about every task we do, right? We should look at those just separately, and we would have separate controls. You all have drug and alcohol programs. You all have fitness for work controls in place. Let's not cloud this specific risk with that extra stuff, right? Because it just blows it out and doesn't add value. Like, look at them separately. So I've used this quite successfully, and it primes the team because they can't sit there anymore and just rattle off the same controls they're used to rattling off in the 100 risk assessments they've done in the past, if they have, right? So this is why I do that. So we want to be specific. So we get all our controls. We're not at this stage. We're just looking at all controls for this confined space, right? It could be, gas monitoring. It could be, isolation and all that sort of thing. Whatever we've got, right? Then when I do this, I actually make a point of going through all of the controls and saying, right, can we eliminate this hazard? For this, can we eliminate this cause? Right, what could we do? Well, could we limit the hazard, the cause, the human interaction? What could we do here? Force this on them. And again, this is what I do for all risk assessments. Actually use it as a process and go through the hierarchy controls, right? And immediately we've almost cancelled level 3, right? So this comes from the code of practice. We've almost cancelled level 3 controls, that admin PPE stuff, right? Because we're focused on a higher level already, because we've already said we're not interested in the lower stuff, right? Let's force it, right? And one of the tests I put to the team, once they've gone, yeah, we've got it, everything we need, I say, okay, if we take all the admin controls out, what's left? Is this enough? Right? Is this enough? And that's what we want to have, right? Push, demand innovation. I push this to the level of discomfort, right? Some things I've done in past workshops to really push things is I've had mechanical engineers and I've primed them beforehand, and I've said, your job is to look for a mechanical engineering solution every single time. That's your job. I don't care about the other controls from you. All I want from you is there a mechanical engineering solution here? And if you've got that internal capacity, that's fantastic. Why don't you use them, right? Why don't you use them? Yeah, there might not be an affordable mechanical engineering control, but at least we've had a look, right? We're actually having a dig and not just repeating what we've done in the past. But they're not all created equal, right? So if we look at all those controls and say we have, let's say over 20 risks, and each one has, say, 10 controls, there's 200 controls there. Now, can we every day check that those controls are effective and working? It's going to be bloody hard, right? So we look for our critical controls and we select them. So this is the definition that I like for a critical control. And sorry, I can't remember where I got it from. I wish I could remember. But this is it. Specific act, object, or technological system, which of itself will prevent or mitigate an incident. Right? They're specifiable, they're measurable, they're auditable, right? And if we didn't have them, they significantly increase the potential for an unwanted event to occur, right? I like that. I think it's quite good. I know there's decision trees and other things out there. Whatever works for you, right? Whatever works for you. I know the ICCM one, I'm not a big fan of theirs, although there are other stuff I am, because it says it's got may apply over multiple events. I'm not interested in that. If it applies for one risk, I'm happy with that, right? The big thing is, right, critical controls are decided by the risk assessment team. I better hurry up. What's not a critical control? A procedure, any procedure. Training, license, and permits. They are not a critical control. They're an administrative process. The critical control can be described in those, but it's the specific act, object, or mechanism, right? So working at heights, it might be the physical act that they clock, they're restrained, right? They've applied for restraint. That's the critical control. It's not the procedure that tells them to do it. It's not the training that tells them to do it. It's not the permit or license. It's what that is, right? So, failing safely. Do our controls allow us to fail safely? Now, there's a safety chain on the end of that. I put that on every single time, even though I've never had a trailer come off and I've towed for 30 years. I put it on because I know it could, right? So if the hitch fails, if the tow ball fails, I've got some control and hopefully it'll mitigate the damage. So one of the questions, do our controls allow us to safely fail? If something goes wrong, will it fail? Will we be safe, right? That's what we're after. So critical control design. This is where the rubber meets the road, right? It sets objective target performance requirements, supporting management systems, monitoring effectiveness. This is the detail. We only do it for critical controls. Now, most critical risks that I've been involved with have 2 to 5 critical controls maximum. Any more than that, I'd say you're pushing the friendship, right? You're probably going too broad with your definition, right? Critical control design. So this is a really useful guide, right? So the mining has been streets ahead of pretty much most other industries in critical control design. And the ICMM, the International Council on Mining Minerals, introduced a couple of guides. One's a good practice guide, one's an implementation guide, right? And both of those have a design form for critical control designs. So you can just go to the ICMM website, you can download them for free. And I suggest you have a look at it. I think they're really cool things, and they're pretty straightforward and easy to look at, right? So worth having a look at. So if we have a look at that, you can just put it into an Excel function. You can put it into, like, Marsh has these things in their critical risk management suite, and it goes through our critical control design. So we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly. So we talk about the critical control performance requirements, right? This is where the detail is. This is what we need to be detailed in here. What is the objective of the critical control? What's it meant to do? What's it based on, right? We put in standards, international standards, Australian standards, right? What's the objective? We've got to be very specific and detailed in here. What are the management systems we have to support it? If we don't have a management system to support it, then we need to have that, make sure that's in place, right? The procedure says, like, so this is one for wearing a life jacket. If we don't have a procedure that tells them to wear life jackets, or when to buy the life jackets, or when to inspect them, replace them, that should be in our procedures, right? We should have that system in place. And lastly, it talks about there on that third column about what activities can we sample from to make sure it's in place, right? Is it effective and in place and working? Will it work if called on, right? What's the target performance, right? Most of the time it'll be 100%, right? What's the trigger? What happens if it doesn't? What could trigger a shutdown, right? Or an investigation? One thing ICMM doesn't have is control failure prevention. And I really like this. How could the control fail? So in this one, the PFDs could be compromised through exposure to the sunlight, right? How do we do that? We make sure we store them outside of direct sun, right? And they're inspected immediately before use, right? And we've got replacement life jackets ready to go, right? How could the control fail? So I really think that's really cool. Monitoring must be planned, right? So remember that third column, we've got purchase requests, inspection records. How are we going to make sure that these are in place, right? Do we do audits? Do we do inspections? Who's doing? How many? Remember when I said develop that framework at the start? This is what I'm talking about. Who's doing the monitoring? Make sure the accountabilities are there. Make sure we've got the tools, right? And I will give a plug to Marsh here. So Marsh, who sponsoring today and putting it on for us, thanks. They do have a great critical control management part in their suite now, module, and it allows you to design your critical risks and controls, and they have a suite of things, a suite of tools that you can do to feed back in and monitor your critical risks, right? That it's in place and that it's effective, right? And lastly, depending upon the size of your organisation, how many critical risks, you might want to think about doing some sort of annual effectiveness test, right? So have the design standards changed, right? Are we still compliant? Have we done our planned tasks like we said we would? Have there been control failures? Have there been audit findings? Have there been, we've done inspections and observations, right? Are those things in place and have we done them, right? Verify the controls are in place and will be effective. And if your target performance is 100%, then that's what we've got to check, right? Are they in place? Will they be 100% effective 100% of the time? So this is where the time takes in, right? This is why we're doing critical controls, because we can't do this for every control. Just impossible, right? So we look for our critical controls, those ones that really matter. Right, quick quality checklist. Make sure the risks are credible, right? Make sure the right people participate in the risk assessment, right? People that do the work, right? And I cannot tell you how many risk assessments I've seen, and all I can see in the participants has been a safety advisor and supervisor. No, that's not a risk assessment. That's an administrative tick in the box. Make sure the controls are specific to the risks. The critical control designs are detailed. To be quite honest, it will take you just as long to do the design of each of the controls as it did to take the other stuff. It is resource intensive to get that depth of detail. And I did have a question before the webinar. Critical control designs are very detailed, right? You must be specific, right? And those additional controls reduce level of risk, right? Not administration. And that's what we're after. So I think, Sarah, that about wraps us up. I think my time is just about done. I've got one question there I see from Samantha. And that question is, for someone new, why don't you like risk matrices? Because I've been in too many risk assessments, Samantha, where they just focus on the process of plugging where risks which fit in a risk matrix, and there's no empirical evidence that they actually serve any value. If you want to prioritize your risk, a good risk scenario will prioritize anyway based on consequence, based on outcome, potential outcome. Chris Harris, is this process best done at project, business, or enterprise? Okay, so it depends, right? You must take in. So Chris says, is this process best done at project, business unit, or enterprise level? Particularly in diverse organisations, risks may be the same, but controls different. 100%, Chris. You must take into some of that local rationality. You might have two different factories or two different sites, and they actually don't have the same equipment, and therefore the same controls wouldn't work. So I would start at an enterprise level, and then I would look to bring in local rationality. But in a diverse organisation, if you can get as many people from those diverse business units or projects, then that's the way to go. But yeah, you start enterprise, but then if you have to, go lower, go further into the business.
I guess you're reading these now. Do you want me to read them?
Sorry, Sarah. I saw them pop up. Right. So, Raza, I hope that's how I pronounce it. For the cause and control assessment workshop, other than the worker, i.e. the people who do the jobs, any other member, e.g. HSC personnel, should be invited in the risk assessment team. Definitely. So as I've already mentioned, engineers, and that's really hurts me because my daughter's an engineer, and that hurts. Engineers are good to have in there. Planners, perhaps. Have a mixture. Supervisors, maybe a manager, because they've got a depth of experience. They've been around a long time, so they're handy to have in there. But any other subject matter expert that you could put in there. Typically, a HSE person will be the person either facilitating or scribing. And that's another tip too. You can't facilitate and scribe and do both jobs effectively, so don't try. Do one or the other. So thanks, Rosa. Great question. Chris Harris again. Also, as a rule of thumb, how many critical controls per risk is getting too much to monitor effectively? Look, I would be very doubtful going above 5 rule of thumb, right? Depends how complex the risk is and how complex the work is, and probably goes back to your previous question, Chris, about that local rationality. I think sometimes, we've got to be careful. So yeah, any more than 5, I think, geez, you've got a lot of critical controls in there. I'd be very careful.
I was muted. All right, so that might be the end of the questions, but it normally isn't. So I have shared a lot of links in the chat panel, and they're Mark's previous webinars on subjects like investigations differently, incident classification differently, and risk assessments, a quick guide for managers. So please check them out if you weren't able to see them. Mark, I think there's another question if you want to.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Thanks for tuning in today, mate. So hi, Mark. Great talk. Thanks. One of the things that I find in risk management is we are good at identifying hazards and controls, but we have a hit and miss approach on reviewing and monitoring controls. It seems your process brings this to a fore, and in particular for the critical ones. Yeah, Gary, that's the thing. We must plan it and design it when we design the critical control at the very start. And if we can, let's build it into existing tools. If you already have inspections and you already have observations, you already have these existing processes, then use those. That's one of the reasons I like the Marsh software, because it actually can build in and feedback directly. Another shameless plug. But yeah, so plan it. So I'd say plan, do, check, act, just like we do with any sort of project work where we're running it properly. So thanks, Gary. And thanks, Miss Fox. Yep, awesome.
All right. Okay. So thanks for the shameless plugs, Mark.
So, yeah. Oh,
I
so look,
keep these things all unbiased. No, I do have to share a webinar next week. The Marsh team, Nigel, people might know him. He explains things really well. He's going to go through smart inspections, our new rules engine, and how that relates, how that can help with the critical control management process. So probably about half an hour next Thursday, and he's going to just show how our inspections are very feature rich, and they include images in the questions for context, and all sorts of rule-based notifications and actions that can follow based on responses and conditional logic and all those sorts of things. So hopefully people find that interesting, just to see how Marsh are doing it. One more question, Mark, if you've got a second.
yep.
Could you, yeah.
Yeah, could you please could you advise what tools we can use for risk assessment from the VBRAHAM? Look, just your normal risk assessment tool does the job, right? And then just create your own. I really, that ICCM or the ICMM template will give you some good stuff. But yeah, I just basically use a workplace risk assessment tool. A bow tie works. Whatever works. You just really want to get those cause and controls. But yeah, even if you just do basically go, these are the things that could cause it, and these are our controls, just 2 columns. Like, you don't need to overthink it. And lastly, look, I'm on LinkedIn, Mark Alston on LinkedIn. I've got my email address there, my website, investigationsdifferently.com.au, info@investigationsdifferently.com.au. My phone number's there. At any stage, look, connect with me, reach out, touch base. If you're just after some advice or anything, I'm happy to share and help where I can. So yeah, everyone have a good day.
Yeah, that was really top information. Thanks, Mark. I've included that link to your website in the final thing of the chat. Of course, those links will come out on the webinar as emailed later today with the podcast and the video recording. So thanks, everyone, for joining us once again. Hopefully we'll see you again next week. Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.